Hello everyone, I'm Holly, as Chad said, previously of Adelaide, working in London for the last 10 or 12 years and making gamesy things. So I'll just very briefly talk about the sort of things I do and then I'll get into the meaty bit of this talk. So I curate events like Game Changers, which was an exhibition at Somerset House which looked at 3 different historical games, mazes, chess and billiards, and looked at how they developed over time and also showed some contemporary twists on them. Some of you might recognise Catacombs of Solaris by Ian McClarty, who I see is over there. Also, I direct Now Play This, which is a festival of experimental game design in London. I guess it's London's equivalent to Freeplay in some ways. We have an exhibition that runs throughout over the course of 9 days this year, which was a long time and very stressful. Previously, we've only done 3 days. And we also have special events, including outdoor stuff and events for members of the public to kind of stumble along and play. I also design games, mostly as part of Matheson Marco, things like games we found at the V&A, in which we took parts of the V&A museum and printed them on game boards and made up board games to play on them. Or the Tritish Museum at the British Museum, which was based on the triangles that are shadowed through into the floor, a sort of a territory-claiming game played with those triangular shadows. Things like inverted operas, which was at the Alta Opera in Frankfurt, where I worked with Rosario Televi and David Helbig, an architect and a composer, to make a piece where players interacted with musicians and the sounds of the city around them in different ways. Cards would give hints about things to do and ways to listen, which might be things like listen to cars in the distance, follow a car until it disappears, kind of trying to bring the sounds of the city into the performance. Or it might be show this card to a musician and see how they respond, and the musician would start playing faster or quieter or make a blur white noise or follow you around for the next 45 seconds. Yeah, that was one of my favourites. And finally, things like One Easy Step, which was an installation at King's College London, where we put patterns on the ground that we thought would induce people to behave playfully with them, and also several mirrored plinths, each of which had the rules for a purely physical game to play in the space put on top of them, things like coin flipping onto a target, or letters that you could stab a finger down, a fortune-telling game where you asked a question and span around and put your finger down and saw what the answer was within that wider context. So that's the sort of thing I do, right? Games, sometimes digital, more often physical, and curation, and putting games in specific spaces. And when I began thinking about Freeplay's theme of the year, introspection, a few different specific moments of play, both historical and within games that I've played myself, came to mind. So I'm going to talk about 24 ways not to play a game, or 24 ways to not play a game. And I'm going to talk about this because of 3 moments that really stuck in my head when I began thinking about what it means to be introspective in a context of a game and what games encourage introspection. Because introspection is this thing that's very hard to spot and identify, right? If it's happening entirely inside someone's head, then what is the evidence in the external world? And as I was thinking about that, 3 different things came up. The first one is this guy. So this is a picture of a Go player from the 19th century, and he's famous for a thing called the ear-reddening game. So the ear-reddening game is an 1840s game in which, I'm not a Go expert, so I'm not going to explain the details, but everyone can understand the wider context of this. It's a famous game in which a man in his 50s, a sort of a Go expert, was sitting around, ready to play some Go, surrounded by his disciples and his students, who were pretty convinced that he was the greatest Go player of all time. And this teenager came up, this guy here, Hinin Bushisaku, came up and was like, I would like to play Go with you, Go expert. And the Go expert said, okay, I'll give you like a 2-stone head start because I'm going to be much better at Go than you are because you're 17. And they started playing a game, and it rapidly became clear that, in fact, he wasn't much better at Go than this teenager, and might only be a little bit better at Go than this teenager. So he called off that game and started another game where they were playing on an even footing for the first time. The newcomer and the sort of old familiar guy playing against each other in the same way. And so Gennon, the guy in his 50s who was the expert, was surrounded by people watching, looking over his shoulder, not necessarily understanding what was going on with the game, because the play was at a sufficiently high level that a lot of the observers and students just couldn't get their heads around what was happening. But nevertheless confident that their guy was going to win. Until at one point, I think something like 24 moves in, a doctor in the audience gasped and said, "Oh my God, he's lost." And his evidence for this was that the tips of Gennon's ears had flushed red. Like, he had spotted this moment at which Gennon had realised he was in trouble, and that maybe he was no longer the greatest Go player in his immediate surroundings or even the room that he was in at that moment. And that moment of realisation is the key thing about this game, right? Not any of the particular surroundings of it, nothing other than that one move and the flushed ears that come the immediate moment after it. That's the thing that gives it its title. That's the thing that's made it go down in history, the ear reddening. I also thought about this game, which quite a lot of you might know. This is called Cursors.io, and this is a game in which you play online as a single cursor, and your aim in each level is to get your cursor to the little green spot. But you need cooperation from other people in order to do this. So in this level, when you turn up, there's a big red bar between the two black bits jutting in, and you can't get through it until there are two cursors on that countdown over there. And once there are two cursors on there, they open it up and other people can get through. You can see here someone scooted through and the other people are left behind, possibly slightly angry. And other than occasional people scrawling thanks or hearts or penises, the only thing you really get in this game of an indication of what the other players are doing and what they're thinking is this cursor, these hundreds of identical cursors. You can't tell one person from another. But all the same, you can sort of tell what they're thinking and what they're doing. You can spot when someone's trying to take their turn at being cooperative on the assumption that they'll get to scoot through afterwards. You can tell when someone's trying to scoot ahead and take advantage of everyone else's kindness. And my favourite bit is you can tell when people have decided they'd have enough of the game, which I can extremely sympathise with. I have never finished this game, and just clicked away to another tab and left their cursor there. The cursor just sits there doing nothing, not moving, until eventually, possibly many minutes later, it finally disappears. And so again, this whole playing space littered with the cursors of abandoned players who have ditched the game in the middle of it and gone to do something else is where you see this key moment of play for them, the bit where they realise that they can't quite be bothered. And I also thought about an upcoming book by Bernie de Coven. So Bernie de Coven was a game designer and writer who's done a lot of important things through the years. He was one of the foundational members of the New Games movement in the 60s. In the 70s, he and others established the Games Preserve, which you can see here as a sort of early archival and game design teaching and play teaching space. He made early experimental video games in the 80s. He's done a whole lot of stuff, and he died a year or two ago, leaving almost but not quite complete manuscript, several different versions of a book he was working on about imagination and the role of imagination in play. And over the last year, one of the things that I've been doing is working with Eric Zimmerman and Celia Pierce to edit that into something that is the best possible representation of its ideas. So this is an advanced sneak peek of this book, not yet published, I think coming out early next year. In this extract, Bernie's just been talking about a game that he likes to play when he's walking along sometimes, which is to imagine a silly version of himself and a serious version of himself arguing about the processes of walking. He then says, imagining something like this, the story we've just explored, is the kind of imaginary journey you can take all by yourself, anywhere. Or if you'd like something with rules, something with a structure to help you start imagining, you could try, for example, one of these walking games as found in Phil Smith's book Mythogeography, A Guide to Walking Sideways. These sorts of walking games can be a wonderful way to practice to keep your imagination working. Here's a bunch of walking fantasies that Smith calls solo-sploran exercises. You are Cupid, match people in the streets. You're a diver, explore the city as if it were underwater. You are a fox in human skin. You're a mist, drift through the city. The city is under occupation by intelligent microbes. You can't tell resistors from the wholly invaded. Do not attract attention to yourself. Choose routes where the least number of people will see you. Hide your hunger. Here's a game that Smith calls Gum Galaxy, where the pavements are covered like a rash in chewing gum. Use chalk to draw lines to connect the pieces of gum in stellar constellations. Name them in Latin. If you don't know any Latin, make it up. Bernie goes on to say that if we look around, we can find walking games everywhere, in our heads and in the way other people behave as they walk. Haven't you played a walking game already, he asks? Followed someone 30 yards behind to help you decide where to go, or stepped over the cracks, or closed your eyes for a moment as you walk in the sun. Try Yoko Ono's city piece from 1963, which goes, step in all the puddles in a city. Or you can look at something like Casual Games for Casual Hikers by Harry Josephine Giles, which has games like Stony Path. Establish a gentle walking rhythm. Without breaking it, kick a small stone ahead of you. Score the number of kicks you make before stumbling or losing the stone. Strive to score higher. When you leave a stone behind, remember to say goodbye. So all of these games are, in a way, intrinsically introspective, right? Which is what made me think of them initially. They're things where, from the outside, you can't really tell whether someone's playing or not. But they also go a step further in that I reckon most people who hear these games will never play them. I myself have never taken a piece of chalk out and connected chewing gum lines and named the constellations. I don't think I've even looked at chewing gum on the pavement while imagining drawing those lines. What I've done is imagined looking at chewing gum on the pavement, imagined drawing the lines and thought a little bit about what that might be and how that might feel. And that seems like it's a valid way of engaging with the game, right? That's still something that causes us to reflect on play in the city and look in a different light on a familiar site within the city. This sort of not even introspective play, but introspective playing at playing is still a way of responding to someone's game work, even if you don't actually play it. So because of these three moments, this sort of doctor watching and seeing ears flush red even when nothing's going on, this littering of abandoned cursors, this imagining playing a game without playing it, I thought that as a way of reflecting on introspection in games, I might talk about 24 different ways that you can not play a game. So we've had three already, right? You can realise something about the game that's in progress. Your ears can flush red. You can suppress the desire to sort of knock the Monopoly board over. You can abandon the game in the middle of it, or you can imagine what it might be like to play the game. Here's a fourth way. You can look at a photo of the game. This is super important to me because this thing here, the one easy step, in order to play this, you would have to go to London in like 2016. This is not currently an option for anyone to play. This was a thing that was there for 10 days and then disappeared and went away. So for me, it's very important to believe that looking at a photo of a game is still a way of interacting with it and responding to it and potentially having an emotional engagement with the ideas of it. You can enact the moves of the game without playing. So if we think of a crime as having often two parts, right? The actus reus and the mens rea, the thing you do and the mental mode and intention that you have while you do it, we can potentially think of games in a similar way. There's the thing that you do within the game, and there's the intent that you have while you do that thing. This is a piece called Flux by a Scottish group called We Throw Switches. And it's a really simple, lovely little game played with this light-up table. There's 10 light panels, 5 blue, 5 pink, button in each one. Two-player game generally. Sometimes people get involved in bigger groups. You stand opposite each other. One of the panels light up and you try to slam the button down as quickly as you possibly can. And then another lights up and you do that and that and that. It takes like 4 seconds to play maximum. It's really, really quick. It's really satisfying, and it's a fun, sort of instantly understandable game. In fact, it's so instantly understandable that children get super into it. We showed this at Now Play this year, and the main thing that you could see whenever you went into that room was parents not playing but enacting play, parents finding ways to enable their children to win. Because although children can play it, children are often very, very tiny, and their reaction speeds and understanding aren't up to beating like a fully engaged adult at this game. But nevertheless, people would do the moves, they would go through the motions and feel some of the pleasures of it, the lighting up, the satisfaction, the texture of the button press without doing what we might think of as wholeheartedly playing. And you can come at that in the other direction as well, right? You can play without enacting the moves. You can imagine playing. One of the things that we did with One Easy Step was that before we installed it, we were very lucky and got to spend a couple of weeks experimenting with the space. We got to put weird things down on the ground and sort of hide out in the history department 7 floors up and take photos and see how people responded. So we did things like this, which was to put a hopscotch in there. First, we put a standard hopscotch court down, which is quite a good way of sort of gauging the playfulness of an area. If you just put a hopscotch court down, the general number to expect, proportion to expect of people engaging with it in some way is about 0.5%. So you can put a thing down and see if it's way above or way below that, you're dealing with somewhere unusual. And then we extended it and we did a mirrored one next to it, and that meant we got quite a lot more active players. We got quite a lot of students in particular hopping along, putting their bags down, sometimes jumping, timing each other, racing their friends. We didn't really get any of the sort of lecturers or people who were clearly cutting through on their way to work actively playing, but what we got was people really visibly sort of playing in their head. We got people who would not hop or noticeably like play, but who would also walk in a very straight line along it and make sure they didn't step in any of the lines, and maybe at the very end they'd give themselves a special treat where they'd be able to put 1 foot in each of the squares next to each other and clearly hopped in their head alongside their serious walking selves as they went. You can document yourself playing. This is another thing that came out of the One Easy Step experimentation. We started putting these feet down and seeing whether people responded to them. Interestingly, with one line, no one followed it. With a few lines, a few people followed it, and the more lines we put down and the more challenging it seemed, the more interesting it was to people, and the more people in some way played with it and sort of followed a trail of feet along. But actually what happened more than that was people took photos of themselves. They would pose on it as if they had left the footprints behind them, or as if they had raced along it or in the middle of it and get their friends to take a picture of them, or they'd do it themselves from a distance. That was the main way that people responded to it. They would make it look as if they were playing without actually doing that. You can accidentally become too involved in a game and realise it's not a game after all. I wouldn't recommend that. It usually means that it turns out to be a metaphor for your life and your marriage is breaking down. Or possibly it means that you're about to be murdered in some sort of 1970s movie where what seemed to be a parlour game has turned all too deadly. You can vaguely hear about a game. To talk about this one, I'm going to talk about 3 different games by a New York game designer called Zach Gage. This is his game Lose Lose. And this is a game that almost nobody has played, because to play this game, you are a little spaceship, you're shooting aliens, but each of these aliens incarnates a file on your computer, and if you shoot the alien, that file is destroyed. So to get on the high score table, and there is a high score table, and there are people who have scores in their hundreds, you either have to risk all of the documents on your computer, or you have to go to all of the trouble of setting up a computer specially with a load of fake files that you don't care about, just in order to get your name on this text document on some dude's webpage. So almost no one has played this, but lots of people have heard about it, and that's fine. That is one of the major ways that is intended as an interaction with this game. It's important, I think, that the game exists, that it's something that is real and theoretically playable and not just a joke and a screenshot that Zach mocked up on Twitter. As Pip and Bow says about this sort of thing, part of the process of making something is discovering what the thing is. So if you just say the idea is not the same thing as the game existing, even if no one actually plays it. But this sort of thing where having the idea instantiated in a game that no one actually plays is really interesting to me. At the other end of Zach's work, you get something like Flip-Flop Solitaire, it's a really nice solitaire variant. I'm not really going to bother saying more about that because none of the stuff that's interesting about that is explicable by me trying to explain how it's different from normal solitaire. Like, you have to play it and find the interest in the process of doing so. The knowing about this game is not really a meaningful engagement with it in the same way that it is with Lose-Lose. And then you get stuff in the middle like this, which is his work Transit Meditation, which we commissioned for Now Play This. This is a unicursal labyrinth. So this is an old-style, church-style labyrinth where there is a single route that goes on a great big curving path, goes to the middle. You stop there, you walk out again. Usually these are tiled on the floor or they're dug in grass. There's not normally walls preventing you from walking over it. The only thing that prevents you from just walking into the middle and walking out again is your sense of engagement with those rules. In this case, Zach has replaced those with tensor barriers, airport security barriers. So the idea of this is that it came from an experience he had where he walked a labyrinth and then several days later was in a very long airport line and thought about how, although these were kind of the same experience, his mental state was very different in both of them. And so this is a concept that's exploring the similarities and the tensions between those different ways of going along a path. You take a flag in, you swap it for a flag of a different colour in the middle, you walk out again. And this is obviously a kind of high concept piece where the explanation is a lot of the stuff that seems to be interesting about it. It's, it's about airport security, it's about tranquility, it's about how the way that we feel about an experience affects the experience, even when the experience is the exact same thing, blah, blah, blah. But you kind of have to actually do it in order to get more than, I think, about 20% of the interestingness out of it. I am an incredibly impatient person and I have never successfully walked a labyrinth. I get 3 minutes in, I go, oh my God, and then I go and sit on a hill while someone else does it and read Twitter. But in this case, I kind of had to do it at some point because it's my festival. And once I'm in there, I couldn't really stop because, again, it would be a bit embarrassing to be unable to complete this extremely straightforward labyrinth that I had myself decided we should have in the courtyard. And also I had a big flag, and it would be really obvious if I put the flag down and tried to crawl out without anyone spotting me. So I was forced by the circumstances of it to complete it and actually do the entire walk. And the first 3-4 minutes was, what am I doing? Oh my God, this is so boring. Those people are talking, they're not meant to be talking. Do I need to brief the people to brief people better when they go in? I'm not even at the middle yet. Those people aren't even in the middle yet. And they went in 3 minutes before me. How long is this going to... It takes about 20 minutes to get in and out again. And only after I pushed through those minutes of internal monologue and eye-rolling did I get to the point where I did the thing that you're meant to do in a labyrinth, right? You accept it. You go the path that tells you to. You don't try to predict it or deny it. You just go with it. And that's something that I don't often do. I'm not a very... obliging or patient person a lot of the time, so being forced into it was a really different experience than just thinking about it or looking at it in a way that isn't always the case. So yeah, you can vaguely hear about a game instead of actually playing it. You can vaguely notice a game in passing. This is another piece that we had not too far away from Transit Meditation. This is by an artist called Christy Minchin. It's called Making Faces. And the idea of this is that it's an interactive sculpture where you can move the pieces around and arrange them in such a way that it makes an abstract face from a different viewpoint. And we had a panel with Zach and Christy on it talking about their games, and I asked them to what extent they balanced the experience of the passerby with the experience of the person playing. Like, if they had to sacrifice the pleasure of one or the other of those, what would they do? And for Zach, it was very much about the experience of walking it as well. Obviously, it's a very visual piece, the labyrinth, and it does have an impact on passers-by, but his focus was on what it felt like to actually do. Whereas for Christy, vaguely noticing the piece was an absolutely okay way of engaging with it. And noticing it less vaguely and stopping and looking at it for a minute was the main way that she envisaged people responding to it, looking at the landscape with it in it, seeing the colours set against the grey of the stone, maybe taking a photo, maybe just looking at it and going, oh, that's nice, and seeing the framework and understanding the playability and the tactility of it without necessarily engaging with it. Which was great because it rained quite a lot and we had to shut this piece down when it rained, but it was fine because looking at it was still possible even in the rain, whereas actually could keep running in the rain. So basically ideal there. You can watch someone else play a game. Obviously, the main way that gets done nowadays is through Let's Play videos, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't have the patience to watch one. I think I have never watched more than about 6 minutes of one at a time. But there are other ways that you can someone play a game. For example, at a festival. This is yet another shot of Now Play This. And the reason I'm showing so many pictures of Now Play This is that when a game is really interesting to us, we often end up showing it at the festival. So then I come to talk about the games later, and the best photos I have available of them are from the festival. But as you can see in this room here, people are sort of looking over shoulders, and a couple of the screens that you can see at the front look like they're blank. And this one here is because the people have just started playing. This is Castles Made of Castles by Nico Disseldorp, who's also a Melburnian, and this will grow as they continue to build on it. But on this other side, you get this kid here watching two people play, even though the kid can only see the blank screen. Because this is a piece by a French group where you have to wear green, blue or red glasses in order to see something on the screen. It all looks white, everything's sort of blown out to absolute whiteness, unless you have this weird wooden headgear where you can flip through and see 3 different scenes that you can interact with in different ways in the 3 different colours. So what he's watching here isn't even the gameplay happening on the screen. It's the process of people trying to figure out what to do. And also he's waiting for a turn himself, right? He's going, oh, I think this is what's going on, and anticipating play. One of the things that we often do when we watch someone play is to slightly imagine ourselves doing it. Or you get something like this, which the super perceptive among you might recognise as being a still from High School Musical 3. Again, I'm not really a sports expert, so my greatest familiarity with the idea of spectatorship of sports is through the basketball games in High School Musicals. But sports have been designed to be watched, right? You don't go to a sports event and feel like you are not engaging thoroughly with it because you're there in the role of a spectator. You have your own things to do. You probably have a team to support. You have, according to this, pom-poms to wave and supportive things to yell to your son. This is another way of coming at the central experience of the game where you are not one of the players, but your engagement is as intended by the whole designed process as theirs is. You can play along with a game, and a lot of game shows are designed to support this. It's a thing where you are not yourself playing, but you can see that other people are, and you are playing in your head alongside them. Most people who watch Wheel of Fortune are not then going to go on Wheel of Fortune, but almost everyone who plays Wheel of Fortune is thinking about what it would be like to play and trying to race people to the answers. And I learnt the other day, in fact, that often game shows will show the audience the question slightly before they show the people who are actually playing the game. So in terms of timing, you feel clever because you answer the question faster than they do, but actually you've had an extra half a second over them. It came up on the screen before they were told. you can hear about a game from its designer. And I'm going to quote from a Robert Yang blog post now to talk about this a little bit. Robert makes these amazing games that are often about intimacy and different aspects of gay sexual experience. This is COBRA Club, which is a dick pic simulator. It's great. Lots of Robert's games get widely played by YouTubers who either grossly or ungrossly respond to it. Yeah, there's a lot of people going, oh my God, what is this weirdo game? But there's also people playing it thoughtfully. And Robert is very aware of the way that this is the way most people encounter his games. So this is from a blog post of his from a couple of years ago. Most people haven't played most games. Conversations about games often start with, oh yeah, I've heard about it, or I haven't played that yet. Thinking about the vast intergalactic politics of EVE Online is so much more interesting than trying to play it. To consume a game, it is no longer necessary to play it. Rather, the most important thing about a game is that it exists, because that means you can think about it. Or maybe games don't even have to exist. Consider the endless press previews and unreleased games that engross so many people. These are purely hypothetical games that are often better than playing the actual finished product. The concept and your explanation of that concept and your audience's understanding of that concept is your game. So Robert talks about how, as part of the process of making his game, he writes the artist statement for that game and updates it on an almost weekly basis as the game itself evolves. So that alongside the process of development, there's also this, how he envisages people finding out about it. He says he has a 5-to-1 ratio of people visiting the itch page for a game and actually downloading it. And even the people who have visited that page are themselves entirely in a minority. So 95% of the people who play his games are people who encounter his games are people who do not also play it. And that designing about and talking about your game with an awareness that that is the way that the majority of people will engage with it is an important thing to do. You can read some nice curatorial text about a game. This is another piece we showed at Now Play This. This is by a guy called Dipyaman Kar. It's called The Back Alleys of Heritage Street. And it is a card game designed to be played by the people who live on a particular street, reflecting on preservation and modernisation and different aspects of how that street will evolve in the future. We show this at Now Play This. It's obviously a very sort of beautiful, physical, enticing game. Almost all of the people who came to Now Play This, including me, could not read the cards because it's in a language that they don't read. And so the main way that people have of engaging with it is looking at it and then reading the text about it, explaining why we have it there and why it exists. And we did think about this quite a lot, whether this was a fair thing to do to the game and the designer, and also whether it would be interesting enough to people to have this thing there that the majority of them wouldn't actually be able to read the card contents. And we decided, yeah, it was probably fine. We talked to Dipyaman about it, and he was happy for it to go ahead. And we found that this was one of the most photographed games at the festival because people enjoyed it on the level of the aesthetic thing and also on the explanations of what it was for. People were interested in the idea that this was a very specific, for a very specific street, and to a lot of people, not understanding it made that clear. It meant that they were forced to read the curatorial text instead of just sort of skimming over it. And obviously for people who did understand it, that was a thing that allowed them to feel pleased and excited by having something that was accessible to them and not to a lot of the people visiting. You can read about how to play a game, as well as curatorial text. We have how to play text. And I think in a museum context and in an exhibition context, it's interesting to think about the ways we read how to play text and comprehend how a game is engaged with without doing it ourselves. This is a Brenda Romero game called Train, which again, probably quite a lot of you know. This is a game about complicity in systems, I guess. This is a game that's played on this big sheet of increasingly shattered glass, and you are trying to transport people in trains, and you gradually realise as you're going along that it is a game about the Holocaust. To engage with this game, again, as with Robert's work, almost everyone who engages with this game hears about it rather than actually playing about it. But the way that you engage with it is to be told the narrative of how play happens, that people are told the rules of the game before they are told what the topic of the game is. And that sort of narrative is very important to understanding how the game works as a thing. So reading about the rules of a game isn't necessarily just understanding them all at once, but understanding the experience of play. However, you can still read about a game without understanding how to play it and have that be meaningful. This is another Brenda piece. This is Black Box. And this is a game that was played once by Brenda herself and will never be played again. And she has not in any way explained what the mechanisms of it were. She's explained that this was about responding to a particular experience in her life, and the way that we as an audience can interact with it is to look at it, sort of speculate about how the play might have worked, look at it as a physical and aesthetic object, and that's basically the end of it. It's still clearly important that it's a game, right? Everything about it physically says this was a playable thing. It's got these very familiar game pieces as part of it. It's not like it exists purely as a sort of an abstract three-dimensional thing without any relation to gameness. But it's not something that we can play, and it's also not something that we can know how someone else was playing. You can try to understand a game, and then you can give up. Another thing that happened when we tested out stuff for One Easy Step was there was a giant chess set up there, which we didn't set up, it was just hanging around there already. So while we were doing hopscotch and while we were doing various other stuff, and this wasn't at the chess set up there, this is a different one, this is in Adelaide, while we watched people engage with or not engage with the hopscotch, we also saw them engage with or not engage with the giant chess set. And we realised that by far the main way that people engage with a giant chess set is they look at it, they try to remember how to play chess, they make 3 or 4 moves, and then they either sit down or just come up with their own way of playing chess. You can also not play a game by thinking you've understood the game, but accidentally playing an entirely different game. This is a thing that's happened to me very often with a game called Rhythmomachia. This is an incredibly complex medieval game which was taught in universities at a time when even chess was dismissed as too frivolous. And there are like 18 different ways of winning, and it's all about geometric and arithmetic progressions. I've played this game 4 times, and at the end of every single time I have realised that I have fundamentally misunderstood the game in some ways. So in another sense, I have never successfully played Rhythmomachia. I've played various sort of Rhythmomachia-likes. Or you can play a different game on purpose instead. This is a collection of people's house rules. At the most recent Now Play This, we invited people to tell us how they played things differently. This person plays Pokemon Go, but they only collect the roundest things. This is a command and conquer where you're trying to build the most attractive base. First to lose all the worms wins in Worms. Settlers of Catan, where you can't look at what's being traded and you have to trust that you're not being betrayed. This is easily the most successful sort of request for contributions from visitors that we have ever had. We got hundreds and hundreds of these. After 3 days, we had to rush print some more of the cards for people to write on. When people play a game, very, very often they're not actually doing it. They're coming up with their own variant and playing that one instead. You can daydream about a game instead of playing it. This is a piece by an artist called Teen Beck, who has made various interactive things. This is a bridge that changes colour when you walk over it. This is a swimming pool, and I don't know how this works, or even if it's interactive, or whether she would object to it being positioned within the scope of a game. But because the rest of her work is so playful, when I look at this, I imagine that this too is in some ways interactive. And I kind of don't care if it's not, and I don't care that it's not available for me to play. And this was again a one-off. I like to think about the idea of being in a magically lit swimming pool with these hordes of sort of steam and gas and dry ice or whatever it is, I honestly don't know, sort of bubbling up around it. You can read a manual to a game. I spend a lot of time reading the SimCity 2000 manual. Nowadays this is less accessible to the young people, sadly. You can lie about having played a game. I tried to find a stock image of Pinocchio playing a video game, but I couldn't. I think that most 6-year-olds will do, if you listen to them long enough, is that they will claim to their friends that they have played Fortnite. Most 6-year-olds, if you ask their parents, have not in fact played Fortnite. And if you listen to their narration of what they did in Fortnite, it sounds increasingly unlikely that they have in fact at any point played it. But they've made up this version of the world in which they've played it, and they share this version with their friends. Or you can lie about not having played a game. This is another olden days one. My brothers got a SNES for Christmas in 1991. Actually, it must have been 1994 because I was allowed to stay up past 8 o'clock. And they went to bed, and it wasn't Christmas yet, so they didn't know they had it. So my mum and I got it out and hooked it up to see if it worked, and we started playing it. And it did work, great. But then we kept playing it, and then an hour and a half later we put it away, and I had to go to bed. And the next night we got it out again to make sure it was still working. And continued to play it. By the time Christmas came, we had finished the entire game and had to fake a sort of a naive, wide-eyed, oh, isn't this exciting at it, when my brothers finally got a go. Or you can buy the game, which is approximately the same thing. I couldn't find a picture of an overcrowded Steam library that so clearly articulated this sense of having a game, and you feel that you have in some way engaged with it, even if you know the chances are you will never actually get around to it. I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to bolt through the end here, but the idea behind talking about this is that if we recognise that when people engage with a game we're making, they will mostly often do this by not playing the game, and think about the different ways that they might not play the game, then we free ourselves up to think about the game in different ways and perhaps consider those ways of not playing and that form of engagement in a way that will improve the experience, not just for players, but for not players. And obviously this is a conference with lots of game developers, so I guess we have to ask ourselves whether it is enough to not play games and whether we can also not make games. So I'm going to finish off very, very quickly by going through 12 different ways to not make a game, 11. You can make up a jokey idea for a game. Mine is a roguelike set in the world of The Devil Wears Prada called Vogue-like. You can intend to make a game but instead read Twitter. This is one of my go-tos. You can start making a game and get distracted by a different game. That's fine. The stuff from your previous game becomes, gardening for the next game. You can get distracted by a different career path, perhaps one that pays better. You can make up a fake game. This is Suzanne Treister, who's an artist in the early 90s. I don't have time to read out her essay on this, but she made these amazing fake games and took camera photos of them and exhibited them. And there's this wonderful, wonderful set of games that never existed, but where she has made up the screenshots from them. You can write a manifesto about games. Emily Reed's Manifesto Jam a year or two ago was one of the most interesting ways of engaging with the thinking behind games that I've seen in the last few years. You can point at something and say it's a game. You've only got 10 seconds to get your hands dry. Quick, make a decision and then it will play out in a 100-minute cutscene. You can talk about a game that you've already made. By showing this game from the V&A, I have doubled the number of people who engaged with that because that game ran for one night only. Say you made a game when you didn't. I obviously didn't make a game called the Tritish Museum. That's nonsensical. How would this thing about territory claiming shadows even work? It would rely on sunlight. It's in London. It's nonsense. You can think about something interesting to do with an existing game. This is Mark Wonacott's Bitsy collage, showing all of the player characters from Bitsy. This is a version of desert golfing that we set up to run for 10 days with people playing and adding to the journey as it went on. This is Catacombs of Solaris again, in competitive version, where people are racing to make this extremely abstract maze generator look like a thing. Or you can just not make a game at all, even a little bit, which is mostly what I've been going for this week. My priorities have been dumplings, naps, and drinking coffee in coffee shops where tiny sparrows fly in through the door. Thank you very much.
We might actually have... Sorry, this on?
Test. Okay. We
might actually have time for one question.
Okay.
Maybe not.
No?
No.
Okay, great. Well,
One question there.
Hi. I guess my question is, this is something that's happening a lot in tabletop RPGs and like solo LARP spaces. And I guess the question there is how to take it from a different way of thinking about games to a different way of making games, or not making games, so to speak. Because I think that it's a conversation that's been happening about people. There's so many, another part of it is that there's just so many more people making games in this space, that it's hard for actually people to play the games that are being made, and keeping up with that, and like how does that,
yeah, no, I think like tabletop RPGs is a really interesting reference point here, because RPGs have grown used, I guess, to the idea that the way people engage with them might be through reading the rulebook and thinking about and speculating, and it's important that the games are still theoretically playable, and probably some people will play it, but writers are very aware that the majority of people who engage with it will perhaps do that just through reading the rulebook. And because it's in a book form and we're used to the idea of a book as a solitary pursuit, I think it feels less weird to them within that context than when people within digital games or installation games do the same thing. So I do think there's a lot that people in other areas of games can take from that, and just the thought that tabletop designers put into the solo experience or the non-active play experience. Part of that is about, I guess, depth of world, which isn't something that is necessarily something that installation games, for example, are interested in doing, but part of it is just about allowing people space to imagine, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Great, thank you so much. Can we give another round of applause?